The house was already glowing when I pulled into the driveway, every gutter lined with warm white lights, every window flickering with candles that made the glass look like it was breathing, and for a second, just a second, it looked like the kind of place people drove past, slowly pointing and saying, "That must be what a real Christmas feels like." But the illusion slipped the moment I turned off the engine and sat there in the quiet, the dashboard ticking softly as it cooled. Because I knew something no one else could see from the street. Every strand of those lights, every electric bill that kept them glowing, every decoration carefully placed to look effortless, had been paid for by me, and still I sat there with process, my hands wrapped around the steering wheel, trying to gather in four. The version of myself that knew how to walk inside smiling, the version that knew how to be useful instead of seen. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the casserole dish, still warm through the cloth I had wrapped around it. The mac and cheese my mother had texted me about 3 days earlier. Not Merry Christmas, not can't wait to see you. Just bring the mac and cheese, the big pan, and I balanced it carefully as I stepped out into the cold, the air sharp enough to sting. My lungs, the crunch of gravel under my shoes, louder than it should have been, like the night itself was announcing my arrival, even though I already knew no one inside would. When I opened the front door, the noise hit me first. Laughter layered over music, the clink of glasses, the low hum of a house full of people who belonged to each other, and I stood there for a heartbeat too long, framed in the doorway with the cold still clinging to my coat, waiting for the natural pause that comes when someone new enters a room, waiting for a head to turn, for a voice to say, "Hey, you made it." But nothing shifted, not the laughter, not the music, not even the air, and it felt like stepping into a scene that had already been written without me. I adjusted my grip on the dish and took a step forward, scanning the room for something familiar to anchor to my cousin. Marcus stretched across the couch with his legs blocking the ottoman. Uncle Rick sunk into the recliner with a beer, angled toward his chest, Aunt Louise leaning over the coffee table refilling glasses like she was part of the furniture, and my little sister Megan standing near the tree with her phone lifted, tilting her head just slightly to catch the lights behind her, while my mother leaned in close, smiling in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years, and I waited. 3 seconds, 5, maybe 8, for someone to notice the person. Standing in the doorway, holding a dish heavy enough to leave an imprint in her palms. But no one did, and it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was worse than that. It was easy, effortless, like my absence and my presence carried the same weight. My mother finally glanced over Megan's shoulder, her eyes landing on me for a fraction of a second before sliding away again, as if I were part of the wall behind me, and she said, "You're late. Put the dish in the kitchen." No smile, no warmth. Just an instruction, and I felt the familiar reflex rise in my chest, the instinct to apologize, to explain the 4-0 minute drive after a 1-2 hour shift, to make it easier for her to keep speaking to me that way, but I swallowed it down and nodded instead, because that was the script I knew best. I moved through the living room past bodies that didn't shift, to make space past conversations that didn't pause my shoulder, brushing the edge of the couch as I squeezed by the heat from the room, wrapping around me too tightly, making it hard to breathe, and I kept my eyes on the kitchen doorway, like it was a finish line, because stopping anywhere in between would mean standing there waiting again, hoping for something that wasn't coming. The kitchen was bright, almost too bright, the overhead lights reflecting off polished counters and spotless appliances, everything arranged like a display, and I set the dish down, carefully adjusting it so it looked intentional, like I belonged there, like I had placed it as part of a plan instead of being told to drop it off. And for a moment, I let my hands rest on the edge of the counter, grounding myself in something solid, before I turned toward the dining room. The table was already set. Of course, it was every plate perfectly aligned, cloth napkins folded with precision glasses, catching the light in clean, sharp lines, and I counted without meaning to 1, 2, 3, all the way to 14, 14. Place settings, arranged in a way that suggested fullness, completeness. A family gathered exactly as it should be, and then at the far end, tucked between the wall and the narrow opening to the kitchen, there it was, the metal folding chair, slightly lower than the others angled, just enough to make it clear it hadn't been part of the original arrangement, and I didn't have to ask. I didn't have to check because I already knew the way you know something you've been pretending not to see for years. I pulled the chair out slowly, the metal legs scraping softly against the floor, a sound that felt too loud in the carefully controlled room, and I sat down, testing the balance as it wobbled under my weight, adjusting my posture to compensate to make it look like it wasn't uncomfortable, like I wasn't aware of the difference. And from the living room, I could hear the rustle of wrapping paper, the rising pitch of excitement as someone picked up the first gift, the room shifting into that warm, shared anticipation that I used to feel part of when I was younger before I understood the roles we were all playing. Dinner blurred into a series of small movements, passing dishes, refilling glasses, smiling at the right moments, laughing softly when someone else laughed, my body moving through the motions with a kind of practiced ease that made it possible to exist in a space that never fully made room for me, and every time the chair shifted beneath me, I adjusted again, steadying myself without drawing attention, because drawing attention would mean explaining, and explaining would mean acknowledging what everyone else had already agreed not to see. When the plates were cleared by me, of course, because no one asked, but it was understood, I stood at the sink with my back to the room, the warm water running over my hands, as I listened to the scrape of chairs and the shuffle of people moving toward the tree, and I dried my hands slowly, giving myself a second before turning around, bracing for the part that always came next. The tree was lit perfectly, the gifts arranged beneath it in neat rows, each one wrapped with care, ribbons tied just tightly enough to hold, but loose enough to look effortless, and my mother stood beside it like she belonged in a photograph, reaching down to pick up the first box with a smile that I didn't reach her eyes until she turned it toward Megan. "My beautiful Megan," she said, her voice warm in a way it had never been directed at me, and the room responded exactly as it always did. Soft gasps, laughter, a chorus of appreciation that filled the space so completely, there was no room left for anything else. One by one, the gifts were handed out, each accompanied by a small performance of affection, a touch on the arm, a word of praise, a moment of connection that lingered just long enough to be seen, and I watched from my place at the edge, my hands folded loosely in my lap, my posture relaxed in a way that felt almost convincing, counting without meaning to. Again, 1, 2, 3, until 13 gifts had been opened. 13 smiles, 13 thank yous, and still nothing in front of me. Not a box, not a card, not even my name spoken into the room. My mother sat back down, smoothing her napkin over her lap, as if the moment had reached its natural conclusion, and I felt something shift inside me, not sharp, not explosive, but steady. Like a door closing quietly in a part of my mind I hadn't known, was still open, and before I could stop myself, before I could decide whether it was worth breaking the pattern, I heard my own voice softer than I expected. Almost lost under the hum of the room, Mom, did I? And she cut me off. Without turning, her gaze still fixed somewhere else. "Be grateful you can sit here," she said, and the words landed with a weight that didn't match their volume. The room going still for half a second, before the laughter came easy, familiar, practiced, and I sat there in the space where something should have been recognition, acknowledgement, anything, and felt the moment stretch just long enough to understand exactly what it meant to be present and unseen at the place. Same time. At first, it didn't feel like anything unusual, just small things that blended into the background of everyday life so seamlessly that even I stopped noticing them, like the way my phone would light up with a message from my mother that never started with hello, never asked how I was doing, but always landed directly on what she needed. "Can you cover the electric this month, or we're a little short on groceries? Just send what you can," and I would read it while standing in the hospital hallway between shifts, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and without thinking too much about it, I would open my banking app, type in the amount, and hit send before the weight of the decision could fully form. It was easier that way, easier to act than to sit with the question of why it always seemed to be me, why the responsibility flowed in one direction and never came back. And over time, those transactions became part of a rhythm, so steady it felt almost invisible, like a second heartbeat I didn't have to listen for anymore. I told myself it was temporary in the beginning, just a rough patch after my mother's situation fell apart, just a few months until things stabilized. But the months stretched into years and the requests didn't stop. They evolved, becoming less like favors and more like expectations. And somewhere along, to the way the language changed too. The softness fading into something more direct, more certain. I need it before Friday. Don't forget, the rent is due. Make sure it clears in time, as if the money wasn't coming from me, but through me, like I was just the middle step in, a process everyone else understood except me. There were moments, small and quiet, where the truth almost surfaced, like the night I was scrolling through Amazon on my break and noticed the account was still logged in under my email. My debit card saved as the default payment method, and in the cart sat a pair of AirPods, a North Face jacket, a few smaller items stacked beneath them, and I remember pausing my thumb hovering over the screen as I did the math without meaning, to adding the numbers together, recognizing the total before. I even checked out the cart history and saw that same amount had already been processed days earlier, the order placed and shipped. The confirmation email buried somewhere in my inbox under lab results and work schedules, and I didn't say anything. I just logged out and closed the app, because confronting it would have required naming it, and naming it would have made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. The bills told the same story if you knew how to read them. The electric statements addressed to my mother but linked to my account, the rent receipts with my name printed clearly at the top as the leaseholder. The automatic withdrawals that lined up too perfectly with the dates my mother would casually mention something being taken care of. And every time I saw one of those details, every time a number matched up in a way that couldn't be coincidence, there was a flicker of something in my chest, not quite anger, not quite clarity, more like a brief interruption in the narrative I had built for myself, the one where I was helping, where this was what family did, where generosity was supposed to feel this way. But then the moment would pass, replaced by the next shift, the next message, the next transfer, and I would slip back into the role without questioning it too deeply, because questioning it would mean asking why no one else seemed to notice. Why no one ever said thank you, in a way that matched the scale of what was being given, why the story everyone told about our family didn't include me at all, even at gatherings, even in rooms where the results of those payments were on full display. The connection was never made out loud. My mother would stand in the center of it all, gesturing to the table, the decorations, the abundance of it, and say things like, "I pulled this together myself," with a kind of practiced humility that drew admiration instead of doubt, and the room would respond exactly as expected: nods, compliments, praise that wrapped around her like a spotlight, and I would sit there at the edge, watching the performance unfold, knowing that every detail they were admiring had passed through my account, at some point, that the food they were eating, the house they were sitting in, even the gifts they were holding had been quietly funded by someone they weren't looking at. It wasn't one big revelation, not a single moment where everything snapped into place. It was a series of small realizations that accumulated over time. Each one easy enough to dismiss on its own, but impossible to ignore once they started to stack, like the way my bank balance never seemed to grow no matter how many hours I worked, or how my savings account stayed at zero while everyone else around me talked about vacations and upgrades and plans for the future, or how the first of the month carried a weight for me that no one else seemed to feel, a quiet pressure that sat just beneath the surface of everything I did. And still, even with all of that, even with the numbers and the patterns and the evidence sitting right in front of me, I didn't fully say it out loud, not to myself, not to anyone else, because saying it would have meant admitting that the dynamic I had accepted for so long wasn't just unfair. It was fundamentally inverted, that the person being overlooked, dismissed, and reduced to a background role was the same person holding the entire structure together. And that kind of realization doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly through bank statements and shopping carts and offhand comments about bills being handled, until one day you look around and realize the life everyone is comfortably living has your fingerprints on every surface, even if no one ever thought to ask whose hands had been doing the work. The laughter didn't stop all at once. It faded in uneven ripples, like a sound that didn't realize it had gone too far until it was already echoing off the walls. And in that brief suspended moment after, my mother's words Grateful. You can sit here. Something inside me shifted so quietly it almost went unnoticed even by me, because it wasn't the kind of reaction I had trained myself to have. It wasn't the quick smile or the soft laugh or the instinct to smooth things over. It was the absence of all of that, a stillness that settled in my chest and spread outward, slow and deliberate, like ink moving through water. I sat there with my hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, feeling the faint vibration of my own pulse in my fingertips, aware of the room in a way I hadn't been before. Every small sound suddenly sharper, more defined, the present and numb nodas, clink of a fork against porcelain, the rustle of wrapping paper, still being folded and set aside, the low murmur of voices picking back up as if nothing significant had just been said, and yet beneath all of it there was something else, something quieter and heavier, a silence that didn't belong to the room but to me, a silence that had been building for years and had finally found a place to settle. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, not the way I usually did, not searching for approval or waiting for a cue on how to respond, but observing, noticing the way she had already turned back to her conversation with Aunt Louise, her expression relaxed, almost pleased, as if the moment had passed exactly as she expected it to, as if my role in it had been fulfilled simply by absorbing it, without disruption. And there was something almost clinical about the way I registered that detail, like I was seeing a pattern instead of a person. Then I shifted my gaze to Rick, who was leaning back in his chair, still wearing that same grin, his fingers tugging at the tag of his new jacket, the one I had paid for without anyone ever acknowledging it, and I realized with a strange clarity that the joke hadn't been an exception. It had been a continuation, just another iteration of something that had been happening in smaller, quieter ways. For as long as I could remember. Around the table, the others had already moved on, conversations overlapping, laughter returning in softer waves, and I noticed how easily the room reset itself, how quickly the discomfort dissolved into normalcy, as if there had never been anything to question in the first place. And that was the part that stayed with me, not the words themselves, but the ease with which they were absorbed, the absence of resistance, the collective agreement that this was acceptable, that this was how things were supposed to be. I became aware of my own breathing, then slow and even not forced, not controlled, just steady, and I realized I wasn't embarrassed in the way I might have expected to be. There was no heat rising to my face, no urge to shrink or disappear. Instead, there was a kind of distance, like I had stepped slightly outside of myself and was watching the scene from a few feet away, seeing the arrangement of the roles, the unspoken rules that governed every interaction, and for the first time I wasn't trying to adjust myself to fit into that structure. I was simply noticing it. My eyes drifted to the empty space in front of me, the place where something should have been a small box, a card, even a token acknowledgement, and I let my gaze rest there longer than I ever would have before, not to dwell on what was missing, but to understand what that absence represented, how it fit into the larger pattern I was beginning to see. And it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden realization that hit like a wave. It was quieter than that, more precise, like a piece of a puzzle sliding into place with a soft, almost imperceptible click. I thought about the past without fully revisiting it, fragments surfacing just long enough to connect the late-night transfers, the messages that never asked but always assumed the way my contributions had been folded into the background of the family narrative until they were no longer visible, even to me. And for a moment there was a temptation to reach for the old responses, to say something light to break the tension, to ask a question that would invite me back into the conversation, to reestablish the version of myself that everyone else seemed comfortable with. But the impulse didn't carry the same weight. It used to, it flickered and faded before it could take hold. Instead, I felt something else, something steadier, a recognition that the effort I had been making all these years to be included, to be appreciated, to be seen, had never actually been part of the equation, that the structure of this dynamic didn't have a place for that version of me, and that realization didn't hurt in the way I might have expected it clarified. The room continued around me, voices rising and falling, plates being shifted, someone reaching across the table for a glass, and I remained, still not frozen, not paralyzed, just present in a way that felt new. As if I had finally stopped moving long enough to see where I actually was. When I spoke, it surprised me how calm my voice sounded, how even as if it belonged to someone who had already made a decision and was simply acknowledging it out loud. "Good to know," I said the words, settling into the space between us without force, without emphasis. And for a second, I wondered if anyone would notice, if the tone alone might signal that something had changed. But no one reacted. Not really. A few glances in my direction that didn't linger, a brief pause that dissolved as quickly as it formed, and then the room carried on, the moment absorbed and neutralized like everything else. But inside the shift held, it didn't dissipate or soften. It remained exactly where it had settled, firm and unmistakable, not loud, not dramatic, just final, in a way that didn't require validation or acknowledgement from anyone else. And as I sat there, listening to the sounds of a conversation that no longer felt like it included me, I understood something with a clarity that didn't leave room for doubt. Nothing had changed in the room, but everything had changed in me. I was 16, the year everything quietly fell apart, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of small, irreversible shifts that rearranged the entire structure of my life before I even had the language to understand what was happening. And if you had looked at our house from the outside back, then you wouldn't have seen anything unusual. The lawn still trimmed, the lights still on the routine, still intact. But inside there was a kind of hollowing out that started the afternoon my mother's second husband left. The kind of absence that doesn't just remove a person, but takes stability with it, takes predictability, takes the invisible scaffolding that holds a household together. I remember the exact sound of the front door closing behind him, not loud, not slammed, just final, like a sentence that didn't need emphasis to be understood, and I stood in the hallway with a glass of water in my hand, watching my mother from a distance as she sat on the edge of the couch, her posture slightly forward as if she hadn't fully processed what had just happened. And for a moment I thought she might stand up, call after him, do something to 2A and I. Interrupt the reality that was settling into the room, but she didn't. She stayed exactly where she was, staring at nothing in particular, and that stillness stretched into the rest of the evening, into the next day, into the week that followed, until it became clear that whatever part of her had been holding things together had left with him. The practical changes came first, subtle enough to ignore at the beginning. The fridge not quite as full as it used to be, the stack of unopened mail growing thicker on the kitchen counter, the conversations about bills shifting from casual mentions to quiet tensions that hung in the air even when no HAs of raises. One spoke about them directly, and I watched all of this from the edge. Not yet involved, but aware in a way that made it impossible to pretend everything was fine. My younger sister Megan was 12, then still young enough to expect that someone else would handle things, still asking what was for dinner without realizing that the question no longer had an automatic answer. And I remember the first night I opened the fridge and saw only a few scattered items. Inside, nothing that could be turned into a meal without effort, without intention. And I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the empty shelves as if something might appear. If I waited until I finally closed the door and reached for a can of soup, the simplest solution, the quickest way to fill the gap without drawing attention to it. My mother came into the kitchen while I was heating it on the stove, her movements slower than usual, her voice softer but not in a comforting way, more like it had been worn down by something she couldn't name. And she said 5 words that settled over everything that came after. "You're the oldest, you understand." And there was no explanation, no discussion, no acknowledgement of what that meant. Just a statement that transferred responsibility without asking if I was ready to carry it. From that point on, the roles shifted in ways that were never formally defined, but immediately enforced. I started picking Megan up from school because my mother stopped remembering the time. I learned how to stretch groceries so they lasted longer. How to prioritize what needed to be paid and what could wait, how to read the tone of a bill just by looking at the envelope, and none of it felt like a choice. It felt like gravity, like something that simply existed and had to be worked and around. I got a part-time job a few weeks later, evenings and weekends, at a small sandwich shop downtown, the kind of place where the smell of bread and grease clung to your clothes long after you left. And I remember standing behind the counter late at night, scraping mayonnaise into bins, wiping down surfaces that would be dirty again in hours, counting the minutes until closing, not because I wanted to go home, but because I knew there were things waiting for me there that needed to be handled. And when my first paycheck came, I didn't think about keeping it, not even for a moment. I handed it to my mother without hesitation, watching as she folded it into her purse with a quick nod. A brief acknowledgment that didn't linger long enough to feel like gratitude. Megan was told she didn't need to worry about any of this, that she should focus on school, that she was still a child, and I accepted that explanation without questioning it, even though the age difference between us was only 4 years, even though I was still in school myself, still trying to keep up, with assignments and exams between shifts, still figuring out who I was supposed to be outside of the role I had been given. There were moments, small and fleeting, where I tried to hold on to something that belonged to me, like the day I won first place at the district science fair, carrying the plaque home with a kind of cautious pride, unsure of how it would be received, but hoping just a little that it might be seen as something worth celebrating, and I taped it to the refrigerator door next to Megan's drawings, positioning it carefully so it wouldn't fall, so it would be visible. But the next morning it was gone, replaced by a list of supplies for Megan's upcoming birthday party, and I found the plaque later in a drawer buried under takeout, menus and loose papers, and I didn't put it back up. I didn't say anything. I just closed the drawer and let that small piece of myself stay hidden. Over time, the routine solidified into something that felt permanent. My days divided between schoolwork and the responsibilities that filled the spaces in between my identity, shaped by what needed to be done rather than what I wanted, and I learned how to move through it efficiently, how to anticipate problems before they surfaced, how to keep everything running without drawing attention to the effort. It required because attention wasn't something I expected anymore. It wasn't part of the system I had been placed into. Looking back, I can see how those years rewired something in me, how they taught me to equate value with usefulness, to measure my worth by how much I could carry without complaint. And by the time I was old enough to question it, the pattern had already taken root so deeply that it felt like the only way. I knew how to exist, and that's the part that makes it hardest to untangle, not the responsibilities themselves, but the belief that they were mine to bear in the first place. It didn't happen all at once. The control, the way her words slowly shaped the boundaries of what I believed I was allowed to feel and what I owed it, built itself in patterns so familiar that I stopped recognizing them as patterns at all, because every time I reached a point where I almost questioned, something almost said no, almost stepped back, she would respond in a way that pulled me right back into place, and the first layer was always the same, subtle but persistent. The quiet reminder that everything I had, everything I was, somehow traced back to her. I gave up everything for you girls. She would say, not loudly, not angrily, but with a kind of tired certainty that made it sound like a fact rather than a claim. And I would hear it at different times over the phone. While I was walking into work, in the background of conversations about money, even casually slipped into unrelated moments, and each time it landed the same way, pressing gently but firmly against any thought that I might be allowed to prioritize myself. Then there was the second layer, the one that came when I hesitated, when I didn't immediately respond the way she expected, the shift in tone that carried just enough hurt to make me feel like I had done something wrong, simply by needing a moment to think. After everything I've done, you're going to don 8%. Question this, she would ask, not waiting for an answer, because the question itself was the point. It reframed the situation instantly, turning a simple request into a test of loyalty, a measure of whether I was a good daughter or not, and I learned quickly that there was only one answer that didn't lead to escalation. But the most effective part, the part that kept everything locked in place, was the way she brought the family into it. Not directly at first, not as an open threat, but as a looming presence that could be activated at any moment. I don't know what I'd tell everyone if I couldn't keep things together, she would say, or they all think I'm handling this on my own, and there was an implication there that didn't need to be spelled out, that if I stepped back, if I disrupted the system, the story would change and I would become the reason things fell apart, and that fear of being seen, labeled, judged was stronger than any frustration I felt in the moment. I remember one conversation more clearly than the others, not because it was different, but because it followed the pattern so perfectly. It was almost like watching a script play out. I had just come off a double shift, exhausted in a way that made everything feel slightly unreal, and I was sitting on the edge of my bed staring at my bank balance, doing the math I had been avoiding for months, realizing that I couldn't keep going like this, without sacrificing everything I might want for my own future. And for once, instead of pushing the thought aside, I acted on it. I called her, my voice careful, measured, trying to frame it in a way that wouldn't trigger the response. "I already anticipated, Mom. I think I need to cut back a little this month," I said, and there was a pause on the other end. Not silence, but a shift, like something recalibrating, and then she moved into the first phase. Confusion laced with disappointment. Cut back. What do you mean cut back? As if the concept itself didn't make sense. As if I had just suggested something unreasonable. And I tried to explain, mentioning saving, mentioning my own expenses, keeping it practical, neutral. But before I could finish, she moved into the second phase, the emotional pivot, her voice softening, breaking slightly at the edges. "I just don't understand how you could say that after everything I sacrificed for you." And there it was again, the familiar line, the one that repositioned the entire conversation, turning my attempt at setting a boundary into an act of ingratitude. I felt it immediately, the tightening in my chest, the instinct to backtrack, to clarify that I wasn't ungrateful, that I still cared, that I wasn't abandoning her, and she didn't even have to push further because she knew the next phase was already in motion. "I guess I'll have to tell the family we can't keep the house," she added quietly, not as a direct accusation but as a consequence, as if she were simply stating a reality I had created. And in that moment, I could see exactly how the story would unfold, how the responsibility would shift from her to me, how the narrative would be told in a way that left no room for my perspective. And it wasn't just hypothetical, it had happened before in smaller ways. Comments passed along, judgments formed without context, and I knew how quickly those opinions solidified. So I did what I had always done. I folded the resistance draining out of me as quickly as it had appeared. "Never mind, I'll send it," I said, and I could hear the change in her voice immediately, the tension easing, the satisfaction barely concealed. "I knew you would understand," she replied, as if the outcome had never been in question, as if my moment of hesitation had simply been a brief deviation from the expected path. Over time, these conversations blurred together, each one reinforcing the same structure, each one making it harder to separate my own needs from the role I had been assigned. And the repetition itself became part of the control, because it wasn't just what she said, it was how often she said it, how consistently the same themes appeared until they started to feel like truths, instead of tactics, until I internalized them, to the point where I didn't need her to say them anymore. I would anticipate them, adjust my behavior before the conversation even happened, preemptively aligning myself with what I knew she expected. And that was the most insidious part, not the moments when she actively pressured me, but the way I learned to pressure myself in her absence, to maintain the system without being asked, because somewhere along the way I had come to believe that stepping outside of it would cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt almost deliberate, like the world had stepped back just enough to let something important happen, and I sat at the small table near the window with my laptop open, the glow of the screen casting a pale light across the surface, my coffee untouched beside it, already cooling. Because once I started, I didn't want anything to interrupt the process I had avoided for far too long. I logged into my bank account and scrolled back further than I ever had before, past the most recent transactions, past the last few months, past the point where the numbers still felt familiar, until I reached the beginning of something I hadn't fully acknowledged, and one by one I began downloading the statements, each file saved with a date that marked another piece of time I had lived, without fully seeing it. 48 months, 48 documents. Each one representing a version of me that had shown up, worked, sent money, and moved on without asking questions. The printer sat on the corner of the desk, an old machine I had bought secondhand years ago, and when I hit print it came to life, with a low mechanical hum pulling the first sheet through with a sound that felt louder than it should have in the stillness of the room, and then another and another, the pages stacking slowly in the tray. Each one identical in structure but different in detail, a physical record of something that had previously existed only as numbers on a screen. I didn't rush it. I let the printer finish, listening to the steady rhythm of paper feeding through the rollers, the slight pause between each page as if even the machine needed a moment to process what it was producing, and when it finally went quiet, I reached for the stack and aligned the edges, carefully, tapping them against the table until they formed a clean, even block, something solid, something I could hold. I picked up a yellow highlighter from the drawer, the cap clicking off with a small, precise sound, and sat back down, positioning the first page in front of me, my hand hovering for a second, before making the first mark, a simple line drawn across a transaction that had once meant nothing more than a quick tap on my phone, now standing out in bright color against the printed text. Impossible to ignore. I moved methodically, page by page, line by line, highlighting every transfer, every payment that had gone to my mother, the repetition becoming clearer with each stroke, the pattern emerging not as an abstract idea, but as something visible, tangible, something that took up space on the page and demanded to be seen. January $1, 200. February $1, 200. March $1, 200. The consistency, almost hypnotic, broken only by the occasional extra amount. Smaller lines that filled in the gaps. $300 for a car repair, $150 for textbooks, $200 for utilities. Each one added without hesitation at the time. Each one now, part of a larger picture that was slowly coming into focus. The more I highlighted, the more the pages changed. The clean, neutral statements transforming into something marked, emphasized, impossible to read casually. The yellow lines cutting through the text like a signal, drawing my attention again and again to the same detail. The same name, the same direction of money flowing out of my account and into a system I had never fully examined. I didn't stop to calculate as I went. I didn't add anything up yet. I just kept moving forward, letting the accumulation build on its own, because I knew that rushing to the final number would skip something important: the process itself, the act of seeing each individual piece before confronting the canned whole. When I reached the last page, my hand paused again, the highlighter resting against the paper, and I set it down carefully, placing it parallel to the edge of the table, as if maintaining order would somehow steady what I was about to do next. I flipped the final sheet over and picked up a pen, the weight of it familiar in my hand, and began writing numbers in the empty space on the back, adding each month, each highlighted amount, checking the figures as I went, my movements slow, deliberate, because this was the part that couldn't be undone, the part that would take everything I had just seen and condense it into a single undeniable result. The first total didn't feel right, so I went through it again line by line, verifying each number, making sure nothing had been missed, nothing misread. And when I finished the second time, the result was the same, the digits sitting there in my own handwriting, clear and unmistakable. I stared at it for a moment, not reacting, just letting the number exist in front of me without immediately assigning meaning to it, because I knew that once I fully understood what it represented, there would be no going back to the version of myself who hadn't seen it. I reached for a small sticky note, the kind I used for reminders for things that needed to be visible, and carefully wrote the number again, pressing the pen firmly enough that the ink wouldn't fade. Then I stood up and walked to the refrigerator, placing it at eye level, smoothing it down so it wouldn't curl at the edges, making sure it would stay exactly where I put it. When I stepped back, the note was the first thing I saw, a bright square against the neutral surface, the number centered in a way that made it impossible to overlook, and I stood there longer than I expected, my eyes fixed on it, my mind slowly catching up to what I had just done, what I had just confirmed. $57, 604 years of work, of late nights, of decisions made quickly and without question, now reduced to a single figure that carried more weight than anything else in the room, and it didn't hit all at once. It didn't crash over me in a wave of emotion. It settled in gradually, the realization unfolding piece by piece, connecting back to a moment I had dismissed, every transaction I had treated as routine, every time I had told myself it was temporary, that it would balance out eventually. I thought about what that number meant in terms. I could understand what it could have been: savings, security options, a future that wasn't constantly deferred. And then I thought about where it had gone, how it had been used, the house, the bills, the gifts, the life that had been built on top of it, without acknowledgment, without recognition, and for the first time the disconnect between those two realities became impossible to ignore. The room remained quiet, unchanged, the same as it had been when I started, but I wasn't. Something had shifted in a way that didn't need to announce itself, didn't need to be dramatic. It was enough that the number existed, that it was real, that it was mine, and as I stood there looking at it, I understood with a clarity that didn't require interpretation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a rough estimate. It was the exact measure of what I had given, and seeing it like this in ink and paper and my own handwriting, there was no longer any space left to pretend it was anything less than what it was. I didn't come to the realization in a burst of anger or some dramatic flash of clarity. It arrived in a quieter, more unsettling way, the kind that forces you to sit with it because there's no denying what you're seeing, and it started with something simple, almost mechanical. Me sitting in my car after a long shift with my phone in my hand, opening the Notes app without really planning, to just needing to put something down in a way that made sense. And I titled the first list without overthinking it, "Things I Do for My Family," the words appearing on the screen with a kind of neutral detachment, like I was documenting someone else's life instead of my own. I started listing them one by one, not in any particular order at first, just whatever came to mind. Rent $1, $200 every month, utilities roughly $150, sometimes more, sometimes less, groceries when needed. Emergencies that never seemed to stop, $200 here, $300 there. Megan's textbooks, Rick's car, holiday dinners, decorations, gifts bought under my mother's name but paid for with my card. And as I wrote, the list grew faster than I expected, each line triggering another memory, another responsibility I had taken on without questioning it at the time, and I kept going, adding details, specifying amounts, turning vague impressions into concrete entries, because I wanted to see it clearly, not just feel it. The list stretched longer, filling the screen, and I realized it wasn't just about money. It was time, energy, mental space, the invisible labor of keeping things running, organizing, remembering, anticipating problems before they surfaced, stepping in, before anyone else even noticed. There was something to fix, and the more I wrote, the more complete. Picture became not exaggerated, not distorted, just accurate in a way I had never allowed myself to see before. When I finally stopped, it wasn't because I had run out of things to add. It was because there was no more space on the screen without scrolling. And I sat there for a moment, reading through what I had written, letting the weight of it settle, not as a feeling but as a fact, something documented, something that existed outside of my head now. Then, almost as an afterthought, I created a second list, the title coming more slowly this time, "Things My Family Does for Me," and I stared at the blank space beneath it longer than I expected to, my thumbs hovering over the keyboard, waiting for something to come to mind, something obvious that I was overlooking, something that would balance what I had just written, because there had to be something, there had to be a reason. I had accepted this dynamic for so long. I tried to think of moments, specific instances where the roles had reversed, where the effort had moved in my direction, but everything that surfaced felt small and insignificant, not because it didn't matter at all, but because it didn't exist on the same scale, not even close, and I hesitated, unsure whether to write those things down, unsure whether including them would be honest or just another way of softening the reality I was starting to see. Eventually, I typed a few words. Tentative, almost reluctant occasional phone calls, brief conversations, moments of acknowledgement that never lasted. And even as I wrote them, I knew they didn't belong in the same category. They weren't contributions. They were fragments. And when I looked at the two lists side by side, the difference was impossible to ignore. One dense, detailed, filled with numbers and actions and responsibilities that extended over years, the other sparse, almost empty, a frantin. Few lines that didn't even attempt to match what was above them. I didn't need to analyze it. I didn't need to interpret what it meant. The contrast spoke for itself in a way that bypassed emotion entirely. It was structural, objective, A simple comparison of input and output, and for the first time I saw the system I had been operating in, not as something emotional or complicated, but as something almost transactional, a flow of resources that moved in one direction without return. The word didn't come to me immediately. Not at first, but the concept was there underlying everything. The idea that I wasn't participating in a mutual relationship, I was sustaining a system, providing something that was consumed without acknowledgment, without replenishment. And as that understanding settled in, the word followed naturally, not forced, not dramatic, just accurate, in a way that felt both obvious and difficult. Except I had become an ATM, not in the exaggerated sense people sometimes use, but in the most literal way, a source of funds that could be accessed when needed, expected to function consistently, reliably, without question, without deviation. And the realization didn't come with immediate anger, it came with a kind of clarity that stripped away the justifications I had built over the years, the idea that this was temporary, that it was necessary, that it would eventually balance out because the lists in front of me showed something else. Entirely, they showed a pattern that had no built-in mechanism for change, no indication that anything would shift unless I changed it myself. I thought about all the times I had told myself this was what family did, that helping was part of love, that sacrifice was expected, and I didn't reject those ideas completely. I understood them in a general sense, but what I was looking at wasn't that it wasn't shared effort or mutual support, it was something else, something that had been normalized, to the point where I had stopped questioning it, and seeing it laid out like this made it impossible to go back to that state of unawareness. The most unsettling part wasn't the imbalance itself, it was how easily I had adapted to it, how naturally I had filled the role without ever asking who had assigned it to me, how I had continued to operate within it even when it no longer made sense. And that realization shifted something deeper than just my understanding of the situation. It changed the way I saw my own behavior within it, not as something imposed entirely from the outside, but as something I had maintained, reinforced, allowed to continue long after I had the ability to step away. I looked at the two lists one more time, the contrast still as stark as it had been when I first noticed it, and for a moment I considered deleting them, closing the app, returning to the version of myself who hadn't seen it this clearly, because there was a kind of comfort in not knowing, in operating on assumption instead of evidence. But I didn't. I left them there, saved visible. Because I understood now that this wasn't just a realization, it was a point of no return, the kind where once you see it, you can't unsee it, and whatever came next would have to be built from that truth, not from the version of the quote-com story I had been telling myself before. The plan didn't arrive as a burst of anger or a need to prove anything. It formed in a quieter, more deliberate way, like something that had been waiting beneath the surface for a long time and finally had enough clarity to take shape. And once it did, it felt less like a decision and more like a correction, a simple realignment between what was happening and what I was willing to allow to continue. I sat at my table with the list still open on my phone, the number on the sticky note, visible from where I was, and instead of reacting to it, instead of letting it pull me into something emotional or impulsive, I reduced everything to steps, small, controlled actions that didn't require explanation or negotiation, because I understood now that explaining had never changed anything before. It had only delayed the outcome. The first step was the simplest and in some ways the most significant. I would stop sending money, not gradually, not with a warning, not with a conversation that could be redirected or manipulated, just a clean break, the absence of a transfer where one had always existed, because I knew that any attempt to justify or soften that choice would only create space for the same patterns to reassert themselves, the same arguments, the same pressure, the same shift from request to expectation. And this time I wasn't interested in participating in that cycle. I was interested in ending it. The second step followed naturally from the first, something I had overlooked for years because I had framed it as a temporary arrangement, something that would eventually resolve itself. But the lease had my name on it. It always had, and that meant the continuation of that living situation was tied directly to a decision I controlled, not one my mother could redefine or reinterpret, and I didn't need to dramatize it. I didn't need to confront anyone about it. I just needed to let it expire, to submit the notice within the required time frame and allow the system to do what it was designed to do. Because unlike the conversations I had with my family, this process didn't depend on emotion or persuasion. It depended on documentation, on terms that had already been agreed to, and that made it reliable in a way nothing else had been. The third step was the only one that required a form of communication, but even that I approached with restraint, not as an attempt to convince or accuse, but as a simple presentation of information: the bank statements, the highlighted transactions, the evidence that existed independent of anyone's interpretation, and I chose carefully who to send it to. Not the entire family, not the group chat that had already proven it wasn't interested in understanding, but Megan, because she was the only one who might still be capable of seeing something beyond the narrative she had been given. And even then, I didn't attach an explanation. I didn't write a long message outlining everything I had been through. I kept it minimal, factual, because the documents spoke for themselves and anything more would have diluted their impact. The final step was the one that felt the most unfamiliar, not because it was complicated, but because it went against everything I had been conditioned to do. I would remain silent, not in the sense of avoiding responsibility or hiding from the consequences, but in the sense of refusing to engage in the patterns that had kept me in place for so long. No defending myself in the group chat, no responding to accusations, no attempts to correct every misunderstanding as it appeared, because I understood now that those interactions weren't designed to reach a resolution. They were designed to pull me back into a role, to keep me explaining, justifying, negotiating. And as long as I was doing that, I was still participating in the same dynamic, just in a different form. Instead, I would let the absence of my actions create its own impact. The missing transfer, the non-renewed lease, the documents that contradicted the existing narrative, all of it working together without requiring my presence in this conversation, because the truth didn't need me to defend it. It only needed to exist long enough for it to become impossible to ignore. I didn't imagine the reactions in detail. I didn't rehearse conversations or anticipate every possible response, because that would have pulled me back into the same mindset I was trying to leave behind, the one where I was responsible, not only for my actions but for everyone else's reactions to them. And that was no longer something I was willing to carry. My responsibility ended with the steps I had outlined. Everything beyond that belonged to the people who would have to adjust to a reality they hadn't prepared for. When I finished writing the plan, I read through it once, not to check for errors, but to confirm that it aligned with what I had realized, that it didn't rely on emotion or approval, that it didn't require cooperation from anyone else. And it didn't. It was self-contained, complete on its own, and that was what made it effective, not because it was aggressive or retaliatory, but because it removed me from a system that had depended on my continued participation. I locked my phone and set it down on the table. The room still quiet, unchanged, but the sense of hesitation that had followed me for so long was no longer there, replaced by something steadier, more neutral, a kind of calm that didn't come from certainty about what would happen next, but from clarity about what I was no longer willing to do. And as I sat there, looking at the space around me without needing to fill it with explanations or second guesses, I understood that the plan didn't need to feel dramatic to be significant. It only needed to be followed step by step, exactly as it was written. The shift didn't take long to arrive. It started as a vibration on the kitchen counter, and then another and another, my phone lighting up in rapid succession, as if something urgent had finally broken through the surface. And when I picked it up, the notifications were already stacking on top of each other. The family group chat, 31 members, a space I had watched from the sidelines for years, without ever really participating, now suddenly alive in a way it had never been before. Messages flooding in faster than I could read them. My mother's name at the top of the thread, her message already pinned by volume alone. I'm heartbroken. Eleliana says she's cutting me off financially. I don't know what I did wrong. I've always tried to be a good mother, and it was almost precise in its construction, the way it framed the situation before anyone else had a chance to ask a question, the way it positioned her as the center of concern and me as source of disruption. and within seconds, the responses began to pile in, each one reinforcing the narrative, each one arriving without hesitation or context. "How could you do this to your mother? That's so cruel. She sacrificed everything for you girls. This isn't right." And I stood there reading them, my thumb scrolling slowly. As the messages kept coming, the rhythm of them accelerating, overlapping, building into something louder than any single voice. And what struck me wasn't just what they were saying, it was how quickly they said it, how confidently they aligned themselves with a version of events that none of them had actually verified, how ready they were to fill in the gaps, assumptions that fit the story they had always been told. Rick's message came a few minutes later, cutting through the thread with a tone that didn't bother to soften itself. "I always knew she was selfish. Apple doesn't fall far from the tree." And I felt the words register somewhere deeper than the others, not because they were more accurate, but because they were more deliberate, reaching for something older, something that had been used before the absence of my father turned into a point of accusation, a way to define me without needing to understand me. And I watched as the message sat there, unchallenged, uncorrected, absorbed into the flow of conversation as if it belonged. The phone kept buzzing in my hand, the constant movement almost mechanical now, and I didn't respond, not immediately, not at all, because I recognized the pattern, even in this new context, the way the pressure was being applied collectively instead of individually, the way the group dynamic amplified the same tactics I had dealt with for years, only now. Louder, faster, more visible. And I understood that stepping into that conversation would only pull me into the same cycle, just with more voices involved. The first call came before the messages had even slowed down my mother's name flashing across the screen, and I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of a need to be deliberate to make sure I wasn't reacting out of habit. And when I picked up, her voice was already in motion, no greeting, no transition, just urgency layered over panic. "What is going on? Why is everyone telling me you're doing this?" And I could hear the shift in her tone. To the difference from the messages she had sent, the way the narrative adjusted depending on the audience. And I kept my voice steady when I responded. I stopped sending money simple, direct, without explanation, because anything more would have opened the door to the same arguments I had already chosen not to engage in. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, and then the escalation came quickly, her voice rising, pulling in every familiar element. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me. You're going to let your own mother lose her home." And I let her finish, not interrupting, not correcting, just listening until the words ran out. And then I repeated the same sentence unchanged. I stopped sending money, and the repetition seemed to disorient her more than any argument could have, because it didn't give her anything to push against, nothing to reframe or redirect. The next call came from Rick, his number appearing on my screen for the first time in years, and when I answered, his voice filled the line immediately, loud, aggressive, as if volume alone could establish authority. "You need to fix this right now. No introduction, no context. I'm just a demand." And I responded with the same calm I had used before. "There's nothing to fix," and the conversation followed a predictable arc, his anger shifting into confusion when he realized the situation wasn't going to adjust to his expectations. "You can't just throw us out," he said, and I corrected him without raising my voice. "The lease ends at the end of the month," a statement, not an argument. And there was a moment of silence on the radio. Other end, the kind that suggests someone is recalculating, trying to understand a reality they hadn't considered before, and then the tone changed again, softer this time, less certain. "Where are we supposed to go?" And I let the question sit there for a second before answering. "You'll have to figure that out," because it was true, and because it was no longer my responsibility to solve it. The calls continued throughout the day, different numbers, different voices, all carrying variations of the same message, some accusatory, some pleading, some attempting to reason with me, as if this were a misunderstanding that could be corrected with the right explanation. And I treated each one the same way, consistent, minimal, refusing to expand the conversation beyond the facts, because I understood that the intensity of their reactions wasn't something I needed to match, it was something I needed to let pass through without attaching myself to it. By the time evening came, the group chat had slowed, not because the issue was resolved, but because the initial surge had exhausted itself, the messages becoming less frequent, more repetitive, looping over the same points without reaching any new conclusions. And I scrolled through them one more time, not to respond, but to observe, to see the pattern fully formed, the way the narrative had been constructed and reinforced in real time, the way my absence from the conversation had allowed it to unfold without interruption. And I realized that this moment of collective reaction, of heightened emotion and rapid escalation, was the peak of something that had been building for years. The point where the system I had stepped out of was reacting to my absence, trying to pull me back into place. And as I set my phone down and let the room return to its original quiet, I understood that the intensity of this reaction, I didn't mean I had made the wrong decision. It meant I had made a significant one. In the days that followed, the noise didn't disappear all at once. It faded in layers like a storm, moving further and further away, until the only thing left was the memory of how loud it had been. And for the first time in a long time, I found myself sitting in silence that didn't feel heavy, didn't feel like something I had to fill, or fix just space, that existed without demanding anything from me. My phone still lit up occasionally. Messages that ranged from cautious check-ins to thinly veiled attempts to reopen conversations I had already chosen to step away from, but I didn't feel the same pull to respond, the same urgency to explain myself or defend my choices, because somewhere along the way, between the lists and the numbers and the moment at that table, something had shifted in how I understood my role, not just in my family, but in my own life. I started noticing small things that had always been there, but had never fully registered: the way my apartment felt different when it was quiet, not empty, but calm; the way my mornings unfolded without the immediate pressure of checking my phone for requests; the absence of that underlying tension that had once shaped even the simplest parts of my day. And it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a sudden transformation, it was subtle, almost understated. Like a weight I had been carrying for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. I didn't spend much time thinking about what my family was doing, not because I didn't care at all, but because I understood that their reactions, their adjustments, their interpretations of what had happened were no longer things I could control or even influence in a meaningful way, and trying to would only pull me back into the same patterns I had just stepped out of. Instead, my focus shifted inward, not in a self-centered way, but in a way that felt necessary, like recalibrating something that had been misaligned for years, and I found myself asking questions I had avoided before, not about what others expected from me, but about what I actually needed, what I wanted my life to look like when it wasn't defined by someone else's emergencies or expectations. The answer didn't come all at once, it unfolded slowly through small decisions, choosing to save instead of send, choosing to rest instead of take on extra shifts out of obligation, choosing to let a message sit unanswered when I knew responding would only lead back to a place I no longer belonged. And each of those choices reinforced something. I was still learning to accept that my worth wasn't tied to how much I could give, that my value didn't increase with every sacrifice I made at my own expense. There were moments, of course, when the old thoughts tried to resurface, the familiar questions about whether I had been too harsh, whether I should have handled things differently, whether there was a way to maintain the connection without losing myself in the process, and I didn't ignore those thoughts. Let them pass through. Acknowledge them without letting them take hold, because I understood now that they were part of the conditioning I had lived with for so long, not necessarily reflections of what was actually true, what felt true. What remained steady, even when everything else shifted, was a simple realization that didn't need to be complicated or justified. I did not owe anyone the cost of my own well-being, not for love, not for family, not for the version of myself they had become accustomed to relying on. That understanding didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the years of effort or the ways I had been shaped by them, but it reframed them, allowed me to see them not as something I had to continue honoring through ongoing sacrifice, but as something I had already given, something that didn't require repetition to be valid. I thought about my grandmother sometimes, the way she had looked at me that day, the clarity in her voice when she said, "I didn't owe anyone for the privilege of being mistreated," and those words stayed with me not as a command but as a permission. I hadn't realized I needed. Permission to step out of a role that had never truly been mine to begin with. The future didn't feel fully defined yet, and I didn't rush to fill in those details. There was a kind of comfort in allowing it to remain open to take shape gradually, instead of forcing it into a plan that might just replicate the same patterns in a different form. And for once, that uncertainty didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like space, like possibility. Sometimes, late at night when everything was quiet, I would think back to that moment at the table, the empty space in front of me, the words that had been said so casually, and I would recognize it for what it had become, not just a point of pain, but a point of clarity, the place where something ended, and something else began, not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively. I didn't know exactly what my family would say about me in the long run, how they would tell the story of what happened, or where they would place the blame. And for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel like something I needed to resolve because their version of the story no longer determined my place. In it, I had stepped out of that narrative, and whatever they chose to believe or say would exist separately from the life I was now building for myself. As I sat there in the quiet, the same quiet that had once felt heavy, now feeling steady and grounded, I realized that closure didn't come from confrontation or final conversations or perfect understanding. It came from the absence of the need for those things, from the decision to move forward without waiting for someone else to acknowledge what had been done or to validate what I already knew to be true. And that realization, simple as it was, carried a sense of finality that didn't require anything more.